In the first stage of Egypt's complex electoral system, we now have the reality that the Islamist bloc has the running, winning about 60% of the vote. Of course, there are two main parties and different factions within this bloc, but Egypt's military rulers have already signalled they don't think the next parliament will be representative enough to oversee the drawing up of a new constitution. Welcome to Agenda with George Friedman. George, an interesting outcome.
The most interesting thing that came out of this election is the fact that the Western media's candidate for power in Egypt really lost, which were the secular Democrats. So think of Egypt right now as having three blocs. The Nasserites, who are secular and military, who run the government. The Islamists, who are divided into various factions and hardly united. And the secular Democrats, those who wanted a European-style constitutional democracy, who've really lost. So the Arab Spring, as we call it, really has changed. The Arab Spring has changed from the idea that what we're seeing now is the emergence of Western-style democracies to the idea that out of the democratic process is going to either come a more Islamist government or the continuation of the military government.
Yes, well, Stratfor has always been doubtful about the so-called Arab Spring, but this is not an outcome sought by the street protesters, nor is it what the US wanted. But both must now have to live with it, haven't they?
Well, in the first place, the street protesters did not represent all of Egypt. They were a few 100,000. It was a very large crowd. They represented some elements of Egypt, but Egypt is a huge country of 80 million, and there was no way that crowd represented them. So the idea that that crowd spoke for Egypt, as was frequently said, was fairly preposterous. I think the issue now really is whether the democratic process will continue, which I think it will, what it will yield, which I think will be a very complex mixed Islamist government, and second, whether that government will be allowed to rule Egypt, or whether the military will continue its historic role since 1952 of being the dominant, modernizing, and controlling force in Egypt. Right now, I'm still betting very much on the military holding power. They will yield in terms of democratic form, but whether they're ever going to concede the ministries, or whether they concede it easily, is really, in my mind, questionable.
But presumably the military will have to make some moves to adapt to the new reality, make some concessions?
Well, they have made a huge concession. They held an election. The idea that they're going to go so far as to actually give those elected power is, I think, a rather dubious assumption. So what they did was allow political parties, and they allowed the political parties to be elected. They may allow some degree of power to the emergent government, but that's ways down the road. There are several elections to be held before that takes place. But you have to remember that the military in Egypt does not see itself as illegitimate. It doesn't see itself as Pinochet was viewed in Chile or as military dictatorships were viewed in Argentina. It was the military that staged the revolution against the monarchy that was subservient to the British. It was the military that saved Egypt from imperialism. That's the way they look at it. It was the military that created some of the modern institutions. And many people, not just in the military, but in Egypt, looked to the military as guaranteeing both the secular nature of the country and also its stability. Because there's a long history, more than a 50-year history of that being the case. So I think the Western tendency to look at a military government as inherently illegitimate really fails to understand Egyptian history. But at the same time, history moves on, but not easily, not cleanly, and usually not peacefully.
Egypt has had the benefit of large swathes of US aid, $2 billion a year since 1979, much of it military aid, I think. Will this continue?
That, of course, is a major question, and we have to remember the origin of that aid. Anwar Sadat, who had been the heir of Nasser's pro-Soviet regime, was prepared both to break with the Soviet Union, denying them bases in Alexandria, air bases in the Nile Delta, and make peace with Israel. The United States was willing to pay for both of those, but particularly willing to pay for the expulsion of the Soviet Union from Egypt. That's what we've been paying for. One thing we get from that is a high degree of control of the Egyptian military, in the sense that a good part of that military is funded by the United States, and a good part of the military is maintained by American technicians. One of the things that everybody's concerned about is the Islamists becoming aggressive militarily. It's very hard to do that if the United States doesn't want them to do that, so long as the United States is doing the funding and so long as the military is being supported by American technicians and contractors. The bottom line is that U.S. military aid is substantial. It was not a gift. We got a great deal for it. And now it's one way to keep a country of 80 million people, the largest Arab country in the world, under control regardless of what kind of government it gets.
So far, the Muslim Brotherhood has indicated it won't tear up the peace treaty with Israel, so presumably, so long as this holds, the aid will continue.
I think the aid for the United States would continue. I'm not sure the aid would end simply if the treaty were suspended or violated. The real issue between Israel and Egypt would be an attempt by Egypt to reoccupy the Sinai Peninsula, which is the buffer zone between the two. I think that the aid question is really second to wondering where the Muslim Brotherhood will finally wind up. I think it's a mistake to look at its current condition and assume that it's its permanent condition. I suspect we'll see many fissures inside of the Muslim Brotherhood. Many different strands emerge, very much in conflict with each other. And this is the real reason that in the end the military may hold power, which is that the opposition to the military, the alternative to the military, is incapable of governing because of their fragmentation.
There's some evidence, at least, that the Islamic bloc, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood, did well because of the economic promises they made in areas like health and welfare. But can they keep these promises?
Well, shockingly, somebody might make an election promise they can't keep. Of course they can't keep them. And of course some people voted for them for that reason. And as they fail to keep the promise, they will get less popular, others will get more popular, and so on and so forth. But after over 50 years of a military government, the transition to a civilian government, even if that takes place, is going to take a long time. In these crowds, there are very few people who've ever served in government, who've ever administered anything. That was in the hands of the military and the civilian bureaucracy that it controlled. This political process, even if it finally winds up ending up in some sort of true civilian, not symbolic control, but true civilian control, even if you go to that point, it's going to take a long time.
George Friedman. And that's Agenda for this week. Until the next time, thanks for giving us your time. Goodbye.